Good morning, friends. It's Saturday, and I'm back with Chapter 22 of my upcoming book, Campaign at Fort Stix. Now it's time to grab a snack, dim the lights, and let me take you into the mists of time with a story I call Wounded in Battle. Wiping the dust from my bike, I oiled the chain and rolled it out of the garage for the first time since we moved to the farm. I hopped on and rolled down the hill casually as I decided where to start looking for yard work. My grandfather kept his own lawn, and the lady across the street from him had just built that house, so the sod hadn't even had time to grow into a lawn yet. Then there was a big gap of large yards and a woodlot up to our driveway, and my Uncle Al's house across the street. He took care of his own yard, which was mostly dirt and gravel, except for his garden and a few patches of grass alongside the house and garage. Beyond these were neighbors I had not met and had no idea of their lawn care. I rolled up to the house next to Uncle Al's and knocked at the door. No answer. I waited a few more minutes and knocked again. Still, no answer. I got on my bike and went to the next house on that side of the street. An elderly lady answered the door and said her grandson always cut her grass. She questioned who I was, and after hearing who my grandparents were, said she would let my grandmother know if she needed my services when she saw her at church. Across the street from this house was a corner lot where I would be catching the school bus. I knew this from talking to my second cousin Kenny. It was a very large lot, and I figured if I could get the job cutting that lawn, it should pay at least $20. I went around the corner to the driveway and parked my bike. Looking around at the yard, it was very large, but I knew I could handle it. I knocked at the door, and the lady who answered seemed annoyed to be bothered. I explained that I was looking for summer jobs and asked if I could cut her grass. She said her husband did it with a tractor, and there was no need of my services. Before I could even thank her, she slammed the door. I had experienced this a few times when I was selling seeds, so it wasn't anything new. Still, I could not say I enjoyed it when people were rude. I slowly worked my way up our street to where it joined the highway, stopping at each house along the way. None of them wanted their grass cut, nor any other chores done. It was almost lunchtime, and I felt I had been rejected enough for one day. I turned my bike toward home and went to find something to eat. As I rode, my mind drifted back to a sunny summer day when I was 5 years old, riding in the back of my father's car. In those days, seat belts were not such a big deal, and I was standing against the back of the seat, balanced on the driveshaft hump, listening to my father and his friend talk. One of them said something about the days before there was electricity or television, and suddenly, my young mind stopped. For a few long moments, I could not grasp the concept that there were not always cars, electricity, and paved roads. The very idea was preposterous. But somehow, I came to grips with this reality and started to observe the world around me. Now things made more sense, like, why were there buildings now where I thought I had seen trees before? The world was changing, and I was part of it, whether I wanted to be or not. Watching television later that same day long ago, it really sank in when I was watching a Western and realized that I was seeing what it was like in the past. Gone were my egotistical notions that everything was in place for me when I arrived, and my innocent acceptance of things that were. So, my dreams of growing up and going to the places in the movies to be a cowboy were shattered. Much like that epiphany when I was small, today drove home the fact that the world was changing and I needed to adapt. I was in a new neighborhood where people owned their houses and things were in motion long before I came around. I needed to find my place here in order to do and obtain the things I wanted. Arriving back at the house, I found my dad in the kitchen taking a big pan of roasted pork out of the oven. He had mixed some of the leftover meat from the cookout with barbecue sauce and was making shredded pork sandwiches. He handed me a paper plate with a sandwich and some potato chips on it and pointed me toward the dining room where Mark was already sitting to eat his. The barbecue was good, and in no time, I was in the kitchen making myself a second sandwich. When I sat back at the table, Dad looked up at me. "I was thinking maybe it was time for us to go to Long Lake," he said, drinking from an open beer. "If you guys want to catch us a bunch of worms, I think we will head out in the morning." Mark seemed almost as excited as I was and could not stop chattering for the rest of the meal. I was definitely looking forward to it. Long Lake was much bigger than the small lake we visited at the beginning of summer, and it had a lot of bigger fish in it too. Once we finished eating, I grabbed a coffee can for worms and led Mark to the garden. "Hey, we need to grab a shovel," Mark said as we rounded the fence into the garden. "No, we don't," I said, and kept heading around the left side of the garden to walk under the willow tree. "But how are we going to dig worms if we don't have a shovel?" Mark whined at me. "We are not going to dig worms," I said with a smile. "But Dad said we have to dig worms," Mark said, his voice getting higher. "If we don't dig worms, then we can't go fishing, and I want to go fishing." "I don't want to dig," I said, hoping he would remember the time he bailed on me when we were filling the ditch with the promise of A&W for lunch. "Then I'll dig," he exclaimed, and turned to go to the garage to get a shovel. I laughed and set the coffee can down. I guess he would have to learn the hard way, I thought to myself as I started moving leaves and plant waste around in my mulch pile. I grabbed a nice handful of shredded leaves and dirt from the bottom and put it in the can for the worms that would soon be there. The mulch pile was close to the southeastern corner of my garden. As such, whenever I watered the garden, it also watered the mulch pile. Grandpa explained to me when I was first starting the garden that the mulch pile needed to be kept damp so the vegetation would rot and make compost. I had learned on my own that worms and nightcrawlers love compost. Raking the leaves and weeds around with my hands, I grabbed and stuffed worms and fat nightcrawlers into the coffee can. I lost count after 6 dozen and kept going until I was sure we had enough. Standing up to take the worms to the house, I watched Mark walk up carrying the shovel. "Where should I dig to find worms?" he asked. "Why do you want to dig worms?" I asked back. "I already got enough for us to go fishing tomorrow." "Nuh-uh," Mark said, looking at me doubtfully. I tipped the can so he could see in. His eyes got big when he saw the can nearly full and crawling with worms. He looked around to see where I had been digging and could not see any spots of disturbed ground. "How did you get all those worms so fast?" he whined at me. "I know that can was empty when we were walking here." "Magic," I said with a grin and headed for the house to put the can in the fridge. "There's no such thing as magic," he protested. "Yes, there is," I said, grinning. "See? Worms." We walked into the house, and as the screen door slammed behind us, Dad walked out of the dining room to get himself another beer. I showed him the can of worms and put a lid on the can before putting them into the refrigerator. He just nodded and headed back to whatever he was doing in the dining room. "Dad," Mark whined, "make Kevin tell me how he got those worms so fast. He said it was magic, but there's no such thing as magic." Dad stopped in his tracks and looked back. "What do you mean there's no such thing as magic? Kevin, how did you get those worms so fast?" "It was magic, Dad," I said. "I went to the mulch pile and conjured them up so I could put them in the can." Dad smiled and looked at Mark. "See? Magic." Mark half groaned, half whined in frustration before he protested. "There's no such thing as magic." Dad looked at me, and I knew he was about to show Mark one of his magic tricks he used at bars to win free beers. He showed Mark his hands. "So, there's no such thing as magic, huh?" He grinned and rubbed his hands together for a minute before acting like he was taking a drag from an invisible cigarette. Then he blew out what looked like cigarette smoke and flipped the imaginary cigarette away. "Wow," Mark said, looking at his hands. "How did you do that?" "Magic," Dad said, waving his hands around. "And now, Presto! I made Kevin disappear. Mark turned to look at me standing by the fridge, but I was not there. Unknown to him, I had slipped out the back door and was watching from outside the kitchen window while Dad was distracting him with rubbing hands and smoke. Giggling to myself, I ran around the house to the front door and slipped into my couch to read a magazine. Mark came wandering through the house a few minutes later and found me laying back on the couch. He did not say anything. He just looked at me, then back up the hall to the kitchen, and shook his head before heading for his room. I was still laughing inside and having a hard time keeping it in. The next morning, I discovered Mom was going to accompany us to the lake and was surprised to find her in the kitchen making bacon, eggs, and toast. It was highly unusual for her to cook breakfast. Usually, if she was involved with breakfast, it was to pour milk over our cereal after telling us we were filling the bowls too full. I sat quietly at the dining table after feeding and watering the chickens, ducks, and turkeys. The chickens were getting bigger, and some of them had started to round out a bit. I knew within a few weeks we should start seeing them laying eggs. As I watched them eat through the dining room window while waiting for breakfast, I wondered how Mom was going to cook the eggs. Typically, she scrambled them, but I was hoping for fried. There was a time you couldn't get me to eat a fried egg unless it was cooked hard. I could not stand the idea of eating a runny yolk until I was 6, on a fishing trip to Lake Pleasant, Arizona with my dad and his friend Benny. Like most 6-year-old boys, I did not like fried eggs. My dad's friend, Benny, bet my dad a case of beer he could get me to eat fried eggs. I was only vaguely aware of the bet. I was busy tangling up my fishing pole as I anxiously anticipating running to the lake edge to fish. The night before, I had seen a big bass cruising the rocks until he stopped under a log just offshore. He was still there at dark when I returned to the camper, and I was anticipating he would be there this morning. I wanted to fish, but my dad said I had to eat first. So I sat at the picnic table and was surprised when Benny set a plate of French toast in front of me. Yeah! I tore into it, looking at the lake just 50 feet away, and did not pay attention to the fork as I ate. Then, there was a wonderful, strange taste, and I looked down and saw egg yolk on my fork. This was not French toast, but rather nested eggs. He had made a hole in the center of the bread and fried the egg inside. Needless to say, my dad lost a case of beer that day. Mom came in and set plates in front of Mark and I. His was scrambled eggs with butter bread, while mine was fried eggs sunny side up with toast. I thanked her and tried to hide my surprise as I wondered what was going on. The eggs were delicious, and I cleaned my plate in no time at all. Putting my plate in the sink and rinsing it, I went outside to put stuff in the truck while Dad and Mom ate. Arriving at the lake, we sat in the truck waiting while Dad rented a boat. As he stood there talking to the owner of the dock, he reached up to scratch the back of his head. This was a sign it would be a while, as he always did that when he was working a deal. When he finally came back to the truck, he told Mom the owner was thinking about having his motorhome painted and wanted an estimate. Dad waved me out of the truck and pointed to a boat at the dock. Then he pointed across the lake to a pavilion and said they would be there waiting. He wanted me to row the boat over there while he got Mom and the baby set up, and then we would go fishing. I hopped in the boat and untied it from the dock. The oars were already in the locks, but I had to push the boat away from the dock before I could use them. Getting it turned around took a minute, but soon I was steadily stroking the oars and headed toward the far side of the lake about a half-mile away. I had rowed the boat around while out fishing with Dad, but usually just from one fishing hole to the next. This was the first time I was in complete control with no one there to supervise or advise. As I passed the halfway mark, I noticed there was quite a bit of water in the boat. I looked back and verified the plug was in, and then noticed the water was coming in through a crack in the hull near the bow. Obviously, The crack was fairly watertight when the boat was at rest, but the pressure of moving water against the crack allowed it to seep in. There were only a couple gallons, so I planned to bail it out once I got to shore since there was no worry of sinking. I nosed the boat up onto the grassy bank and climbed out with the bow line in hand. Dad came over and drove a wooden stake in the ground and tied up the boat. I looked back across the lake. I had rowed all the way by myself and was not even tired. It did not take long to get the fishing gear loaded up, and after Dad made sure Mom and the baby were comfortable at the pavilion, we headed out onto the lake. He was rowing this time, and once he got going fast enough, he reached back and took the plug out of the boat. "What are you doing?" Mark shrieked. "We're going to sink without the plug in." "No, we will not sink," Dad said, and stopped rowing long enough to light a cigarette. As the boat slowed, all the water that went out the plug hole came back in, and even brought friends. I could see Mark was about to have a fit, and had to stifle a laugh. Once his smoke was lit, Dad resumed rowing and all the water went out again. Once it was drained, he put the plug back in, and let the boat drift next to some submerged trees where he tied it up. Looking down into the clear water, I could see a school of big panfish hovering in the branches of the sunken trees. There were also a few larger shadows, which I was sure were bass. It was hard to tell, as they blended with the darkness below. Excited, I grabbed a nightcrawler from the worm can and threaded it onto my hook. The barb poked out just in front of the large smooth segment, and I knew I had a great bait ready. Without a ripple, I let the worm down and watched as it drifted past the branches. Several fish moved toward it, and I even thought one was about to eat it, but then they moved back to where they were and watched it pass. As I got down to the larger shadows, I was sure one of them would find my fat nightcrawler irresistible. But no, they did not even look at it as the panfish had. I watched it slip into the darkness and close the bail. I would have to be patient. A gentle breeze blew across the lake, easing the warming I felt from the morning sun. It seemed like I was waiting forever and still had not gotten a bite. My dad had already stopped using nightcrawlers and had tied on a spinner. He repeatedly cast and retrieved it in an effort to catch bass. The fish just did not seem hungry. I began to daydream about that morning on Lake Pleasant so long ago, when I had been tricked into eating fried eggs. Once I was finally allowed to head for the water, I went straight to where I saw the bass. The water was crystal clear, and I could see the bass just offshore, suspended below the log. He had to be at least a foot long. I reached into my pocket and grabbed the piece of cheese I had snuck from the cooler. Tearing it into pieces, I put the majority on a rock next to me, and some on a rock a few feet away where I had found a friend. Within moments, a kangaroo rat came out and sat watching me as he had his breakfast. Satisfied that all was well with the world, I carefully wadded a piece of cheese on my hook and cast to the log. Well, I tried. My red and white bobber fell dismally short. The bass heard the splash and turned slightly toward it, then back the way he was. I was about to reel in and try again when I saw the swarm of 2-inch bluegill that were busy attacking my bait. Fascinated, I watched as they formed a circle and took turns dashing in to strip my hook. When the hook was bare, I baited up and tried again. Dang! Still cast too short, and right in the middle of the bluegills. Again, the bass turned to the sound, but because of the frenzied feeding of the bluegills, he did not turn back this time. In fact, he was edging closer. The hook was bare, so I baited up and cast again. The bluegills darted here and there, slinking along the rocks now. They were aware of the bass and knew that bass loved to eat small bluegill. The bass edged halfway to my bait as the bluegill deftly stripped my hook. I baited again, my last piece of cheese, and cast. The bobber hit the water with a splash. The bluegill swarmed, and just as one zipped in to take the bait, the bass rocketed forward and slammed my cheese-laden number 6 Eagle Claw bait holder. I fought him hard and well for at least 2 minutes before I finally managed to drag him onto the rocks. Running back to the camper to show my dad, I thought nothing of the feeding pattern created by the bluegill. The fact that the bluegills were bass food, nor the fact that the bass was probably trying to eat the bluegill that had singled himself out as he dashed for my cheese. I was thinking that I had caught a bass and was very proud. Looking down at the fish in the tree again, I saw there was a couple dozen minnows swimming next to the boat. I reached in my tackle box and got out the net I used to get crawdads and minnows from the bait buckets. Very slowly, I eased the net into the water and moved closer to the minnows and under them. I lifted slowly and was rewarded with a half a dozen minnows about 1.5 inches long. Maybe if the fish didn't want worms, they would want minnows. I reeled up my line and stripped the now soggy nightcrawler from my hook. Tossing it into the water, I grabbed one of the minnows and carefully hooked it through the lips. Then I eased it down like I had with the worms. Once again, I watched as the fish inspected the bait and returned to their position in the trees. The darker shadows ignored it as well. Now I was getting frustrated. I picked the minnow up to the level of the panfish and let it down again. Still nothing. Then I lifted and settled the minnow in a jigging motion repeatedly for a few minutes, and still nothing. I reeled the minnow up and looked at him. He was dead. Frustrated, I tried to pull it off the hook to grab another when his head separated from his body and his body fell into the water. Immediately, one of the panfish raced up and ate the body. I dropped the head in as well, and was again rewarded with a panfish eating it. Now the question was, did the fish not eat it because of the hook, or because the bait was whole? I grabbed another minnow and ripped it in half. "Ooh," Mark said, "that's nasty." Dad looked over to see what Mark was talking about and watched as I baited my hook with the minnow body and dropped it into the water. Almost immediately I hooked a fish and fought it into the boat. It was a very nice crappie. I pushed him into the fish basket and put the other half of the minnow on the hook. It barely hit the water when another crappie ate it. I was grinning as I added the second fish to the basket. I handed my dad a couple of the minnows and rebaited my hook as he baited his and Mark's. In moments, all three of us were adding crappie to the basket. In less than 5 minutes, we had over a dozen crappie in the basket, and I was dropping the last piece of minnow into the water. This time, it sank further, and I watched as one of the large shadows turned and inhaled it. Before long, I landed a bass of about 2 pounds to add to the basket. We searched around the boat for more minnows, but there were none to be found. We tried worms again, but the fish were not interested. Then Dad said he was getting hungry and we would return to the shore for lunch. I was hungry too, so I did not object. I was pretty happy with having figured out how to make the fish eat our baits. Mom was actually pleased to see the fish we brought and told Dad we should have them tomorrow night. I was glad to see her smiling and talking because ever since she had the baby, I had not heard her talk much except to fight with Dad. She also had hot dogs and potato chips ready for lunch when we returned, so we sat at the picnic table to eat. As I always did, I was looking at the lake while I ate. I could imagine the big fish that were in there and looked forward to another opportunity to catch them. When we were finished eating, Dad said he was going to walk the bank and throw lures for bass while he digested. Since we were not going back out in the boat right away, I baited up a nightcrawler and cast from the shore in hopes of catching some catfish. I rested the rod in the boat on an oarlock so I could explore while keeping an eye on it. The water was alive with fish and tadpoles. As I waded along in the shallows trying to catch more minnows, I soon lost interest and began splashing and swimming. I put the minnow net away and decided to reel in my rod and just swim for a while. Mark was sitting in the water in a sandy spot near Mom, just splashing and playing. Wading out among the lily pads, I swam along the edge of the open water, just enjoying the day. Then I had an idea. I could play crocodile. I got really low in the water and swam along with just my nose and the top of my head out of the water. Mark had turned his back to the water as he talked to Mom, and I saw my opportunity. I lined up and began to swim slowly toward him, anticipating the shrieks to come. I was about 6 feet away when I pushed against the bottom to surge into the shallows. I rocketed forward like a crocodile on the attack, and then suddenly stopped as I felt something hit my stomach and push the air out of my lungs. It hurt pretty bad just below my ribs. I stood up in a cloud of bloody water and looked at my stomach. Blood was gushing down across my belly, and there was a hole just below my ribs big enough to poke a finger in. I saw some meat poking out, and then realized there were 2 holes where something had gone in and then come out. Holding my hand over it, I walked up the bank to my mom. "Something stabbed me," I said, moving my hand. "What did you do?" my mother asked and grabbed a towel to put on it. She sat me on the picnic bench and cleaned the wound. It was not very deep and would not require me to go to the hospital, but would need sewed up. When my dad finally returned from his walk, Mom told him we needed to head home because I needed stitches again. It had pretty much stopped bleeding and was covered with a dressing taped around my ribs. Dad peeked under, and after stating it did not look too bad, told me to return the boat to the dock and they would pick me up there. By the time I tied the boat to the dock, my t-shirt was soaked with blood from the wound down to my shorts. There was probably blood on the shorts as well, but they were cut-off blue jeans, so it was not noticeable. I climbed into the back of the truck and actually sat back in my seat for the ride, as it was painful to sit up. My great-aunt Florence was out in her yard when we got home, and seeing me covered in blood followed us into the house with questions. For some reason, even though I had watched him sew himself up several times, Dad could not stand the idea of sewing me up. Aunt Florence pushed him aside and grabbed the medical kit. As a former nurse, she had no reservations about it. She handed me a small glass of brown liquid and said to drink it, which I did. It was about 2 shots of whiskey, and to this day, I'm still not sure if it was the needle sewing me up or the whiskey that lit the bigger fire in my belly. I hope you enjoyed this look into the campaign at Fort Stix. That's all for now, but I'll be back again next week with another story, just for you. Until then, sleep well.